Mothers of the believers. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had either 11 or 12 wives, of whom 9 were alive when he passed away. A short account of each of the mothers of the believers is given below. Khadeejah bin Khuwaylid, may Allah be pleased with her. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her when he was 25 years old. She bore all the Prophet, peace be upon him's children except Ibrahim, and was the Prophet, peace be upon him's only wife while she lived. She died at the age of 65 in the month of Ramadan, 10 years after the Prophet, peace be upon him, began his mission, and was buried in Khajun. Saudah bint Zam'ah, may Allah be pleased with her. She was previously married to her cousin, Sakran bin Amr. The couple embraced Islam and migrated to Abyssinia. On their return to Makkah, Sakran died. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married Saudah in Shawwal, 1 month after Khadeejah died. She died in Shawwal 54 AH. Aisha Siddeeqah bint Abu Bakr Siddeeq, may Allah be pleased with her. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her in Shawwal, a year after marrying Saudah. Aisha was the only virgin the Prophet, peace be upon him, married, and was regarded as the best loved of all the Prophet, peace be upon him's wives. She was the most learned female Muslim jurist in history. She passed away on Ramadan 17, 57 AH, and was buried in Bakr. Hafsah bint Umar bin Khattab, may Allah be pleased with her. She was married to Huyayy bin Akhtab, who died from a wound incurred at the Battle of Badr. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her in Shaban 3 AH, after she came out of mourning. She died in Medina in Shaban 45 AH, at the age of 60, and was buried in Bakr. Zaynab bint Khuzaymah, may Allah be pleased with her. She was the widow of Ubadah bin Harith, may Allah be pleased with him, who was martyred in the Battle of Badr. According to some others, she was married to Abdullah bin Jahsh, may Allah be pleased with him, who was martyred in the Battle of Uhud. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her in 4 AH. In the days of ignorance, she was known as al-Masakin, mother of the destitute, for her compassion toward the poor. She died in Rabi al-Akhir 4 AH, 8 months after her marriage to the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Prophet, peace be upon him, led her funeral prayer and buried her in Bakr. Salamah, or Hind bint Abi Umayyah, may Allah be pleased with her. She was married to Abu Salamah, may Allah be pleased with him. She bore several children while married to him, but he died in Jamad al-Akhir 4 AH. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her at the end of Shawwal 4 AH. She was a great jurist and one of the wisest women of her time. She died in 59 AH at the age of 84. Other sources date her death in 62 AH. She was buried in Bakr. Zaynab bint Jahsh bin Riqab, may Allah be pleased with her. She was the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him's aunt, Umaymah bint Abdul Muttalib. She was initially married to Zayd bint Haritha, but the couple had problems and Zayd divorced her. Zayd had been adopted by the Prophet, peace be upon him, and according to ancient Arab customs, it was unlawful for a man to marry the former wife of an adopted son. Allah ordered the Prophet, peace be upon him, to marry Zaynab to show that this ancient Arab custom had been abolished. The marriage took place in Dhul Qa'dah 5 AH. Other sources date the marriage in 4 AH. She died in 20 AH at the age of 53 and was the first to die among the Prophet, peace be upon him, surviving wives. Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, led the funeral prayer and she was buried in Bakr. Juwayriyah bint al-Harith, may Allah be pleased with her. She was brought as a prisoner from the Battle of Banu al-Mustalik in Shaban in the year 5 or 6 AH and was given to Thabit bin Qais. He decided to free her in return for a certain amount. The Prophet, peace be upon him, paid Thabit the amount he requested, freed her and married her. Having seen this, the Muslims set free 100 families of the Banu al-Mustalik, saying that they were the in-laws of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Thus, she proved herself a blessing for her people. She died in Rabi' al-Awwal, 56 AH, at the age of 65. Habeebah, or Ramla bint Abi Sufyan, may Allah be pleased with her. She came to be known as Habeebah, the mother of Habeebah, because of her daughter Habeebah. As the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him's fierce enemy, Abu Sufyan bin Harb, she made many sacrifices for her faith and migrated to Abyssinia along with her husband Ubaydullah bin Jahsh. Ubaydullah later converted to Christianity and died, but Habeebah remained steadfast in faith. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, sent his envoy, Umar bin Umayyah to the king of Abyssinia, he also sent a proposal to the widowed Habeebah. The king married her to the Prophet, peace be upon him, paying her 400 dinars in dowry, and sent her to the Prophet, peace be upon him, under the escort of Shurabil bin Hasna. After the Prophet, peace be upon him, returned from Khaybar, he married Habeebah in Safar or Rabi' al-Awwal, 7 AH. She either died in 42 or 44 AH. Safiyyah bint Huyayy bin Akhtab, may Allah be pleased with her. She was the daughter of the chieftain of the Jewish tribe of Banu Nadir and a descendant of the Prophet Harun, Aaron, peace be upon him. She was taken captive in Khaybar and given to the Prophet, peace be upon him, because of her status. The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked her to accept Islam, and she did so. He then set her free and married her in 7 AH on the eve of the conquest of Khaybar. Her death is variously dated around 36, 50 and 52 AH. She too was buried in Bakr. Maymoona bint Harith Hilaliya, may Allah be pleased with her. She was the sister of Abbas's wife, al-Fadl Lababa al-Kubra bint Harith Hilaliya. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her in Dhul Qa'dah, 7 AH. She came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, as his bride at Sarf, 9 miles outside Mecca. She also died at Sarf in 38, 61 or 62 AH and was buried there. Her gravesite is known even today. There is no question that these 11 women were married to the Prophet, peace be upon him. However, some scholars have disagreed over the status of Rayhana bint Zayd, some saying she became the Prophet, peace be upon him's wife in Muharram, 6 AH. She belonged to the Banu Nadir and was the wife of a man from Banu Qurayza. She was captured in the battle against Banu Qurayza, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, chose her for himself. It is also said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not set her free and kept her as a maid. She passed away upon the Prophet, peace be upon him's return from his farewell pilgrimage, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, buried her in Bakr. The Prophet, peace be upon him, also had a maid named Maria Gibtiya, Mary the Copt, who was presented to him by Muqawqis. She bore the Prophet, peace be upon him, a son named Ibrahim. She died in 15 or 16 AH and was buried in Bakr. The Prophet, peace be upon him, his children. All the Prophet, peace be upon him's offspring, with the exception of Ibrahim, were born to Khadeejah, may Allah be pleased with her. Below is a brief account of the Prophet, peace be upon him's children. Qasim, he was the eldest son of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and thus the Prophet, peace be upon him, was called Abu Qasim, the father of Qasim. He died when he was about 2 years old. Zaynab, she was the eldest daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him. She was born after Qasim and was married to Abu al-As bin Rabi'ah, the son of her aunt Hala bint Khuwaylid. Zaynab had a son named Ali and a daughter Umama, whom the Prophet, peace be upon him, would place in his lap during prayer. Zaynab died in the earlier part of 8 AH in Medina. Ruqayyah, she was married to Uthman bin Affan, may Allah be pleased with him, and gave birth to a son, Abdullah, who died at the age of 6 when a rooster gouged his eye. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was at the Battle of Badr when Ruqayyah passed away. She had already been buried when Zayd bin Haritha reached Medina with the news of victory at Badr. Kulthoom. After the death of Ruqayyah, the Prophet, peace be upon him, returned from Badr and gave Kulthoom to Uthman bin Affan in marriage. She had no children and died in 9 AH and was buried in Baqi. Fatima, the youngest daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him, she was married to Ali bin Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, after the Battle of Badr. She gave birth to 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein, and 2 daughters, Zaynab and Kulthoom, may Allah be pleased with them all. Fatima died 6 months after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. All 5 of the children mentioned above were born before the Prophet, peace be upon him, was appointed Allah's messenger. Abdullah. There is some difference of opinion about whether Abdullah was born before or after the advent of Islam. He was the last of the Prophet, peace be upon him, sons, born to Khadeejah, may Allah be pleased with her, and died during childhood. Ibrahim. Ibrahim was born in Medina in Jamad al-Awwal or Jamad al-Akhir, 9 AH. His mother was the Prophet's, peace be upon him, maid, Maria Qibtiyah. On the day of his death, Shawwal 29:10 AH, a solar eclipse occurred in Medina. The people believed that the eclipse was to commemorate Ibrahim's death, but the Prophet, peace be upon him, informed them that astronomical events were not affected by human affairs. Ibrahim was 16 or 18 months old when he died and was buried in Baqi, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "He will be nursed by one of the maids in paradise." The Prophet, peace be upon him's features and character. The Prophet, peace be upon him's physical appearance was described in detail by his companions. The Prophet, peace be upon him's face was fair, attractive and round. Whenever he was pleased, his face shone bright like the full moon, but it would turn crimson when he was angry. If sweat appeared on his face, the beads glistened like pearls, and the fragrance of his perspiration excelled the smell of musk. The Prophet, peace be upon him's cheeks were soft, his forehead wide, and his eyebrows thin and arched. His eyes were wide, with black pupils, while the whites were mixed with crimson. He had long, thick eyelashes. The bridge of the Prophet, peace be upon him's nose was high and shiny. His mouth was wide, and there were spaces between each of his teeth. His teeth were bright, appearing like tiny hailstones when he smiled, and they sparkled as he talked. The Prophet, peace be upon him's beard was black, thick and full, covering most of his chest. A few grey hairs showed on his earlobes and chin. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had a large head on a long neck. His hair was slightly curly, and he wore it parted in the middle. Sometimes he kept his hair so long it touched both his shoulders, and while at other times it fell just above or below his earlobes. He had a few grey hairs above his forehead, but there were no more than 20 grey hairs on his head and beard together. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was big-boned, with large elbows, shoulders, knees and wrists. His palms and feet were wide, his arms were heavy and hairy, and his heels and calves were light. He had broad, hirsute shoulders, and his chest was broad and hairless, with only a line of hair running from his chest to his navel. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was of a medium build, neither fat nor thin. He had a straight body. Although he was not particularly tall, he rose above most men in height. Several of the Prophet, peace be upon him's companions, have mentioned a fragrance sweeter than any perfume emanating from the Prophet, peace be upon him's body. Anas says, "I never smelt any musk or any such perfume that was as sweet as the fragrance of the Prophet, peace be upon him." Jabir says, "The Prophet, peace be upon him's fragrance lingered after he left, and we could tell which path he had taken by sniffing the air. If the Prophet, peace be upon him, happened to shake hands with anyone, the fragrance would remain with that person for the whole day. When he spread his hand over a child's head, others would discern his fragrance on the child." Sulaym used to collect some of the Prophet, peace be upon him, sweat in a small bottle and would mix it with perfume. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was swift-footed and had a firm step. He would rise with a jerk and walk swiftly but smoothly, as if going down a slope. He would turn swiftly and gracefully. The Prophet, peace be upon him, never seemed to tire when he walked, and nobody could keep pace with him. Abu Hurairah says, "I have never seen anyone who walked as quickly as the Prophet, peace be upon him. It looked as if the earth rolled itself up for him when he walked. We would tire ourselves out walking with him, while he would move on with ease." The Prophet, peace be upon him's voice was slightly loud, his speech eloquent. He looked dignified in silence and attractive while speaking. He always spoke to the point, and his words were explicit and distinct. Quite naturally, he was a powerful orator. The Prophet, peace be upon him, usually seemed cheerful, and he liked to smile. Even when others were rude to him, he was never harsh and rude. He never raised his voice in the marketplace. If faced with a choice between two options, the Prophet, peace be upon him, would always choose the easier one, provided that it did not lead to sin. Above everything else, he avoided sinning or anything leading to disobedience of Allah. He never sought revenge for any offence committed against himself, but when the honour of Allah was at stake, he would certainly punish the offender. As we have seen over the course of the events in his life, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was generous, brave, strong, and extraordinarily patient. Never vulgar or obscene. His dislike of something was apparent in his face. He never stared directly at anyone, nor did he ever glare at anyone in displeasure. He never rebuked his servant, nor was he ever heard saying something unkind about anyone. Even before his appointment as Allah's messenger, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy. He always kept his promises and remained humble even in victory. He respected the ties of kinship, attending the funerals of his relatives and companions. He sat with the poor and needy and accepted invitations extended to him from slaves. At the height of his power as the head of the Islamic State, he lived modestly. He never attempted to outdo others in serving rich food or wearing expensive clothing.